My name is Timothy Clancy. I'm the Chief Muleteer of the InfoMullet, and this is Bonky. We're back again after a little hiatus, and I've got a new friend here with me today. We're trying a new format called a MicroMullet. This is going to be a short-form conversational style that we use to capture current events in the news and things of interest that we may not have as a deeper form dive. We will have a preview of some of our longer form content coming up. And just to start off, Bruce is here with me today. Bruce is a good friend and colleague. Bruce, you want to give a quick introduction?
Sure, I'm Bruce Butler, and I'm a co-founder of Dialectic, and I'm serving now as the Director of Operations.
Thanks, Bruce. Bruce and I have known each other for about 15, 20 years now. We go way back into the IBM days. Uh, as for myself, as you know, I'm the founder of Dialectic along with Bruce. And also, I have a master's of science in simulation science and insurgency dynamics and a PhD in system dynamics with violence and instability of non-state actors. May come in handy today. Bruce, what are we talking about today?
Well, what I wanted to talk about today was that there was a bombing inside Iran that ISIS took credit for, and I was wondering if you had a take of what's going on with that.
Sure. So, kind of let's start with the basics. There was a bombing a few days ago. It was in Kerman, Iran. It targeted the mausoleum of the former General Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Iran Revolutionary Guards and specifically the Quds unit within it, which is sort of their special forces. As with all these bombings, the razor rule applies. First 72 hours, a lot of mixed information came out. It wasn't really certain. There are some reports that it was two suitcase bombs left at the location, others that there were suicide bombers who were killed in the attack, but it caused a lot of casualties. Unfortunately, about 100 people died, close to 260, 270 were injured, and it was a pretty devastating terror attack inside the heart of Iran at this mausoleum for a fairly famous general.
So you mentioned Soleimani, but who is Soleimani?
So Soleimani is kind of, if you were to talk about the American Revolution and you took Benjamin Franklin with his diplomacy and you took George Washington with his military skill and you kind of combined them together, that's who Soleimani was for a long part of the last sort of Iran's expansion and influence in the region. And, you asked the question, what would happen to the American Revolution if Benjamin Franklin and George Washington had been killed? Well, that's kind of the question about Soleimani getting killed. He was killed by the U.S. January 4th, 2020, literally just several years ago, which I think is part of the timing of this attack is excuse me, it would have been January 2nd, to mark the anniversary of his death by U.S. drone strikes. But actually, Soleimani's background goes way back into the revolution. He actually rose to sort of influence after the Ayatollah Khomeini took over Iran in the Iranian Revolution in '79. Almost immediately, Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Iran to try and make some territorial claims, thinking that it might be a good time to press his territorial claims with that recent change. And so it was a very hard fight for Iran for a long period of time. They were outgunned, outmatched. This was a revolutionary government. It was getting its feet under. It had lost, obviously, all U.S. support after taking hostages. Very
Hmm.
infamous incident. And Soleimani sort of rose to the ranks. He began at a very low level in the military. And at the time, Iran's military was almost doing suicide waves trying to defend itself from this invasion. And he kind of grew up in this environment and distinguished himself as a military commander very early on and was influential in forming the backbone of what came to be known as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is the primary military force of Iran. It covers all the different services. But within that thing, Soleimani also headed up what is known as Quds, QODS or QUDS, Quds. It's kind of like, it's a little bit different. It's like if you took the U.S. Special Forces, you took the Department of State diplomacy, and then you added like some of the defense contractors and merged them all together. So in Iran, coming out of this Iran-Iraq war, you had this massive military industrial complex that was run by generals in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And Soleimani was one of the top. He wasn't necessarily always the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but he was the leader of the Quds. And as a general, he held this role where the generals were actively involved in running the munitions factories, the defense, what we would think of as defense contractors. They were actively military officers while also sort of running these organizations. So he becomes a political power player in Iran in the 90s and the early aughts, and he's gaining influence. He's really crafting, he's starting to build his diplomacy chops. And then when obviously the US invades Iraq in 2004, sort of an opportunity presents itself. We destabilize Iraq, we take out Saddam Hussein, and just for background in the region, you got to remember that the main power bases in the region, there's Arab Sunni, which is Sunni is one branch of Islam. There's Arab Shia. Shia is another branch of Islam. One way to think about it is Shiaism is sort of closer to Catholicism and has a strict hierarchy of religion with like the Ayatollah, supreme Ayatollahs, kind of like the Pope, and they have people down. Sunniism is more like Protestantism, where they have local imams. There's no unified structure. There's lots of other doctrinal issues. This isn't really something on the religious aspects, but these two groups have been in tension. Iraq is a Shia majority state, where Saddam, as a Sunni ethnic minority, had been sort of suppressing the Shia majority all the way back to when he took power in the 70s. And the U.S. kind of opened the door for a change in dynamics in the region. And here's Iran, which is a Shia majority. You have Soleimani, that's an exceptional military commander. He's gained political and diplomatic chops through this Iranian unique infrastructure where he's playing both politics and military. And he begins moving in. He gains a nickname of the Shadow Commander. And what that means is that for several years in Iraq, he's behind the scenes. He's helping organize insurgencies. He's helping organize terror attacks. He's building capabilities. He's coming with a bag of money. If you're willing to open the door, he's looking at America as a potential enemy, but he's not out there in front. He's operating through proxies and local Iraqis to kind of gain influence. And he's building up this influence in Iraq. And he's got a grander vision in play. And this is important to understand kind of why eventually he came to be killed by the U.S., why ISIS attacked him. If you think about the region, south of Iraq, you have the Gulf Cooperation Council. This is Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all these locations. These are Sunni-dominated small countries, but very rich in oil. And this is where all the oil in the Persian Gulf comes from. You have Iran across the Persian Gulf, dominated by Shia. This tension exists. Also, Iran has influence on the in Syria and Lebanon. They supported Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's a Shia-dominated militia that came about in the 80s Civil War, in the Beirut Civil War in Lebanon, and is now becomes a power player, becomes an active part of the political coalition gathering Lebanon. Iran also, in the early 90s, made friends with Hamas. And that was a weird thing because Hamas is a Sunni organization. So sometimes, organizations make strange bedfalls, but they become supporters of Hamas. And, if you look at a map, Iran can only get to Israel to resupply Hamas, or it can only get to Lebanon if it goes south down into the Indian Sea, up through the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. And that is a huge choke point. The Suez Canal has been controlled by the U.S. militarily. It's got an agreement between Egypt and Israel. That's a choke point. And it's very, very difficult for Iran to supply Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as Syria, with their arms and equipments and have influence. So they begin moving into Iraq. And you can kind of think of this as two sides of a horn. Soleimani orchestrates this shadow commander influence in Iraq. So he's actively fighting the U.S. This is not just diplomacy here. He was providing IEDs. He was providing technical infrastructure. He's also influencing the Houthis down in Yemen, down on the Horn of Africa. So he's kind of encircling Saudi Arabia, this Sunni enemy that rather than going after the director, he's encircling them in this expansionist sort of approach, two prongs. And I'll put up a map on this. I have several InfoMullet articles I'll be referencing. All the links for those will be below. I'll throw up some screenshots as well. But then, so he gains a lot of influence in Iraq. He's the power behind the scenes in Iraq, at least from a military standpoint. If you think about the Iraq power structure, you have the Ayatollah Muqtada al-Sadr is a fairly aggressive militant Shia Ayatollah. And then you have Ayatollah al-Sistani, who's also Shia. He's a more moderate. He's moving for democracy and reforms and elections. And two things happened in 2011 that are key for this story. On the one hand, the U.S. withdraws from Iraq. It's not a complete withdrawal. We've always had troops there. But for the most part, the large presence under President Obama is withdrawn. So that leaves Iraq now with no overarching structure other than the very fragile democracy that was in place when we left. The other thing that happens is the Arab Spring begins spreading across the Middle East. This is a whole different discussion, but it reaches Syria in 2011, and some protests turn into violent repressions by the Assad regime. And by 2012, you have a full-blown civil war. Now, Assad needs help. And here's the situation where Soleimani's looking at the chessboard in the Middle East, or the Go board in the Middle East. He's already influencing that southern arc, and he sees if he can get influence in Iraq and he can help out Assad in Syria, he has a route to the sea where he can create a railroad that goes straight from Iran across northern Iraq, northern Syria, and links into the Mediterranean. And this is a huge coup for the Iranians, because what it means is they can bypass the Suez Canal, put all their arms and munitions on big railway cars, and just use rail transport to resupply Hezbollah and Hamas. They have a base on the coast of Syria. I think it's Lataki, it might be, where they have a naval base. They could begin using naval forces in the Mediterranean. This would change the entire dynamic. So this is Soleimani's strategic vision and why he matters, and how he came to power, and why he became a thorn in the U.S. side, not just opposing us in Iraq, but also, when the Syrian Civil War, he ended up bringing Quds militias into Syria to fight on the side of Assad. He was forming these popular mobilization committees that are basically armed militias in Iraq. They're Iraqi citizens, but they kind of get their funding, sponsorship, and influence from Iran, and specifically Soleimani. So here's an individual, like I said, he's got the Benjamin Franklin skill with diplomacy, and he's got the George Washington skill at military. And I'm not saying personality-wise they're the same. It's not, the analogies have a limits, but he's got a unique set of combination and skills that makes him one of the biggest players on the board about 2014, 2013, this time frame.
That's very interesting. And I do have some follow-up questions, especially,
Sure.
the relationship to what's going on today in Gaza. Also, you mentioned a few things I'll bring up. But before I get there, I was wondering if you have anything that you want to share that you might have coming up.
Yeah, so we're, like I said, there's a new introduction video on the YouTube channel. We're experimenting with our Ask Me Anything content that we used to do during the pandemic. Rather than doing one show every 2 weeks, it's kind of split between 5 and 8 topics. We're focusing on one topic to do a deep dive on that. It'll be 1 to 2 hours, but we are going to invite our Patreon subscribers to join us. And so the first deep dive content we're going to have is, bring up the share here. Right. So what we're going to do is it's an Ask Me Anything on Trump's insurrection. So this is obviously a hot topic. Colorado's kicked him off the primary ballot. Maine's moved him off the primary ballot. The Supreme Court's taken up the case. A lot of questions. What we want to do is really go through and give that TDLDR up front, but that full context. We're not trying to say politics or anything. We want to equip people to understand what are these issues. We're going to go through a couple topics. First of all, what's the 14th Amendment, Section 3 in the eligibility suit? What are we talking about here? Second, what is an insurrection? This happens to be something I'm a little specialist in. I can help describe what is the statutory definition of the insurrection, but also go through examples of insurrections in history. Ask, was January 6th an insurrection? Why might we think it is, or why might people think it's not? Then, was Trump involved in an insurrection? And go through that. And I think people are going to be surprised that there are some things that are a little more clear than others. Others seem to say that it wasn't. We're going to go through all that. We're going to take a look at all the issues. And then, some of these more down in the minutia, people are thinking like, oh, it's clear he's in an insurrection and it's clear the case should be ruled that way. But in all these Supreme Court cases, there's always those little implications that are kind of going to come up. So one of them we're going to go through is, who is an officer in the United States? What does that qualify? And what are these implications of the Colorado and Maine case for the Supreme Court? So we're going to advertise this to our Patreons. By the way, if you haven't yet, like, click, follow, subscribe. Check out our Patreon channel over at patreon.com/InfoMullet. If you're a Patreon, we'll go ahead. There's a certain tier that gets an invite. You'll have a chance to join us as a live audience. And so as I present this, you can ask questions. It'll be just like our old AMA format, but we're really going to focus on one topic and go deep.
Oh, interesting. Okay, looking forward to that. So, getting back to Soleimani and asking some additional questions, can you break out like the background of the Islamic State?
Yeah, so this is really why the break point of 2013, 2014 happened. So first of all, you go way back. There was al-Zarqawi, was the original militant. He's a Jordanian who went over to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets as part of the Mujahideen, linked up with what was then Al-Qaeda. And it was interesting because he had an unusual background. He was a street thug. He was kind of a criminal guy. He had a gangster past. He didn't mesh well with most of the Al-Qaeda principals. They tended to be more educated, master's degrees of engineering, lawyers, doctors. They tended to consider themselves religious scholars, and they wanted nothing to do with criminals. So he didn't really play nice with them, but he did get along with Osama bin Laden and made kind of a personal connection. He moves over to Iraq, and obviously those we have a lot of infomullets up there from the historical, the lead up to the Iraq War. He was one of the individuals that the Bush administration was using as justification to go in Iraq. I don't think that was a really good justification. I'm on record as saying the Iraq War invasion was a bad idea. But he moves into Iraq and begins forming a militant network. It went through a couple name changes, but it came known as Al Qaeda in Iraq. And Al Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, was Al Qaeda's partner in Iraq working with Osama bin Laden. Al-Zarqawi swore bayat, that's the oath of loyalty. He was supporting Osama bin Laden. And this goes through several iterations. It causes the huge insurgency in Iraq caused by Al Qaeda in Iraq, the Iraq Civil War that breaks out between the Shia and the Sunni. You have death squads in the street. You have murders at night. That's Al Qaeda in Iraq on one side fighting it. And then you have these Soleimani-backed Shia militias being supported on the other, fighting a civil war underneath the U.S. occupation insurgency. So there's a multi-layered conflict. Al Qaeda in Iraq, al-Zarqawi was killed. His network disbanded. There was the Anbar uprising where the Sunni themselves got tired of these guys and kind of, cooperated with the U.S. to kick them out. And so Al Qaeda in Iraq goes through a quiet period where it goes through several iterations of different names, and this is where you get a lot of the names. But long story short, it goes over to Syria. The core of it moves over to Syria, and it's in place as an Al Qaeda affiliate, but it's calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI. And then when the Syrian Civil War kicks off, they are perfectly well situated to take power in a city called al-Raqqa, which is they seized power in that city 2013. That gave them a city, and from that they began expanding in Syria. They really only came on the radar for the U.S. in late 2013. They took Fallujah and Ramadi in rapid order. There were some protests going on, this ongoing tension between the minority Arab Sunnis and the majority Arab Shia. That conflict had led to some protests in Ramadi and Fallujah, and that was that ISIS took advantage of that, seized power, and now they've got large cities, and all of a sudden people are like, well, what's going on? And from that, in 2014, they just blow out. This is when most people probably started hearing about ISIS. They are all over Iraq. They take almost a third of Iraq. They do what's called the Anbar offensive. They rapidly take large cities. They take Mosul. It falls in 3 days. They're just rampaging all over. They're expanding in Syria. They're getting oil wells, which is giving them oil money, which gives them ability to fund. And all of a sudden, Soleimani's plan of this northern arc is disrupted because here's this Sunni Salafi Takfiri, bitter opposed enemy to everything he believes in, right in the middle of that pathway. So you can think about Iran is building an empire that surrounds the Gulf states and has this connection through northern Iraq and Syria. But here's now ISIS emerging right in the middle of that, and you can't get around them. And all of a sudden, you have a conflict inside the Syrian Civil War. So Iran supporting Assad against the Syrian rebels, but at the same time, his Quds militia and his Bazi militia, these are sort of more paramilitary types, he's bringing all these troops over from Iran. They're now fighting ISIS to who's going to control Syria. They're fighting in Iraq. And this huge war, this is simultaneous with the U.S. intervention. Obviously, U.S. policy, we don't work well with Iran. We were not necessarily coordinating with them, but this is a case of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And over time, we begin fighting ISIS through American intervention, and the Iranians are fighting them, and you begin seeing this. But I'll put up an article here. In 2017, I said that the shadow commander, that's Soleimani, and the ghost, which is al-Baghdadi. Baghdadi was the leader of ISIS. He's the one who was a U.S. prisoner, detained, was released, ended up going back to ISIS, becoming an influential leader, became their leader, and was the one who declared them the so-called Islamic Caliphate. He was the major leader. In 2017, I said these are the two most dangerous individuals in the Middle East. Soleimani because of the Iranian influence, Baghdadi because of the ISIS influence, and they're fighting each other. In fact, speak of terrorism, The reason I wrote that article, and I'll throw a link in the comments below, and I'll put a
Hmm.
screenshot up here. The reason I wrote that article is at that time, ISIS attacked the heart of Iran. They attacked the mausoleum of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, and they attacked the parliament with suicide attacks from teams that killed many. So here is ISIS not just getting in the way, but saying, hey, buddy, we can hit you where it hurts and we'll go inside Iran. And so it's
Hmm.
kind of like this is coming back again, this attack recently. This may be not on the radar of a bunch of American followers, but this has got a history. This conflict has a history here in the region.
Well, you mentioned that, and you mentioned in the past that these organizations have taken advantage of conflict in the area. And I think all of our listeners and watchers have, at some level, understand what's going on in Gaza. So, do you think, in this instance, that ISIS is taking advantage of what's going on in Gaza
You know,
by this
ISIS is an
bombing?
odd bird because they sing to their own tune. It's really interesting. We often want to put, and this is, I think, one of the big criticisms I had of President Obama. He mistakenly called ISIS the Junior Varsity League. He said Al Qaeda was Kobe, and these are guys wearing a Kobe shirt. We try and put ISIS into a playbook that makes sense to us, but they really sing to their own tune.
Hmm.
And historically, they've been the spoiler. So, those, we'll put some links. I did some podcasts and things on the Hamas v. Israel conflict. We won't go much into that. My opinion looking at all this is that it was not, although obviously Iran supports Hamas, obviously Iran supports Hezbollah, I do not think they really knew this was going to happen, and
Hmm.
certainly didn't know the extent that Hamas invasion on October 7th would cause so much catastrophe and death and destruction inside Israel. If
Hmm.
they did, they would have had something prepared. Both Hezbollah and Iran was caught flat-footed. They had no secondary thing. So I don't think Iran was really expecting this. I mean, strategically, they're partners. This is, their buddies in Hamas, but they certainly weren't ready. And now they've got this conflict that they're kind of being drawn into that was probably a lot bigger than what even Hamas anticipated. And I
Hmm.
have a mega mullet I'm working on now called Netanyahu's Barbarossa that will go
Hmm.
into all the details of why October 7th played out the way it did. I'll get that up. That's going to be a blog entry. But
Hmm.
I think ISIS. So what's interesting in this is that the group that attacked Iran, we think of ISIS being in the West, right? We think of it being
Hmm.
in Iraq, Syria, but ISIS has a provincial structure, and ISIS in the Khorasan province is the province of ISIS that's in Afghanistan. So the U.S. intelligence is that this attack was done by ISIS Khorasan, which means it came from the east. Now, ISIS in Afghanistan has been fighting the Taliban there for a long time. They do not get along with Al Qaeda. There's a big split. When Osama bin Laden died, I can go into it later in more detail if you want to follow up. They split off from Al Qaeda. They became their own player. They've been fighting Al Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan for years, really struggling because they were sort of didn't have much of a presence. But they are known for big, prolific bombings that cause mass casualties. They did one in Kabul that killed about 500 people. They're sort of known for this large symbolic attack. And the intelligence thinks that it's actually ISIS in Khorasan that launched the attack in Kerman that we're talking about, which means it came from the east, not the west. And that's kind of a little bit of a different take, but it shows how ISIS's structure is built into these different provinces where these provincial commands can launch their own operations. ISIS did take credit. They claimed it. So
Hmm.
it's not something that I think there's much doubt ISIS was behind it, but the
Hmm.
attack came from Afghanistan, which may be a reflection of the circumstance there after that debacle of a withdrawal and the disaster that ended up being.
Yeah. Yes. It'll be interesting to see that if ISIS is trying to just take advantage of this situation, or they're trying to to
Certainly, I
leverage it.
don't think it hurts that Iran is now juggling a lot of plates in the air.
Hmm.
An operation like this, though, you got to think that something like this typically gets planned 18 months in advance. This isn't something you just wing. So my guess is they were probably already planning an attack like this. And remember, the attack happened very close to the anniversary of Soleimani's death, which we haven't talked about. We can talk about soon. But he was
Hmm.
killed by the U.S. around the time they attacked the mausoleum. So my guess is this operation was already in plan before the Hamas v. Israel war broke out. And that's just a happy coincidence for ISIS to take advantage of the chaos and sort of sucker punch one of their enemies while the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, and if we were talking about the players, and there's a minor player, because I understand that the Houthis, and I don't know if the attacks are still going on, were attacking shipping in the region as a protest to what was going on in Gaza, that they wanted to have more support for the Palestinian people. And you had mentioned their relationship to Iran and the whole thing. So what part do they play in all of
Yeah,
this?
so the we're talking about Yemen. So Yemen, as part of that Arab Spring I mentioned, right?
Yeah.
It went like a wave, a tidal wave through the Middle East, and a lot of regimes collapsed. Egypt's regime collapsed, Tunisia's regime collapsed, Syria went into civil war, the Libyan civil war kicked off, but it wasn't really the outcomes were very mixed. The Egyptian military dictatorship collapsed. There was a brief experiment with democracy, and then the military dictatorship came right back in. In Yemen, you had an entrenched power that was based in the capital, and there was these sort of insurgents called the Houthis that were sort of in the mountains, and they were, affiliated. They're Shia. They're a different kind of Shia. The Iranian Shia, we call them Khomeinists. They tend to look at Islam as the role of the state. It's very much a
Mhm.
state. The Houthis are 12ers, a little bit of a different doctrinal split, but they were getting some support from Iran. And then this Arab Spring comes up and causes a collapse of the center, which allows the Houthis to come in and effectively try and take control. Now, it's never really that they've established themselves in control, but Saudi Arabia sees this happening and looks at its southern flank. And remember, Iran's strategy, Soleimani's strategy specifically, the double horns of the envelopment, and I'll put a map up to show this, where they're going through Yemen in the south to basically surround the GCC. So Saudi Arabia is playing a Cold War. They launch an attack, aerial bombardments, civilian casualties. It's been a real problematic intervention in Yemen. Lots of starvation, lots of humanitarian problems. But Saudi Arabia is reacting to this. These Houthis don't have, they're a non-state actor. They have the ability to launch rockets. They have the ability to do drones. They've been doing a lot of attack on shipping that's close to them and like pipeline infrastructure. They've even reached into Saudi Arabia, but they can't hit Israel from where they are. So now what you have is when Hamas invades Israel and has that thing, and Israel retaliates with Gaza and does all that destruction, the Houthi, they're a regional player. They can't touch Israel, but they can touch the shipping in that area and the bases, the U.S. military base in the area. And
Mhm.
those rockets are largely coming from Iran. There's
Mhm.
some of them are locally made, but Iran is the military supplier for the Houthis. So this is what Soleimani's goal was to create these proxies that Iran could use to influence. He doesn't need the Houthis to reach Israel. He can have the Houthis reach the shipping in the
Right.
Persian Gulf where all that oil is. He can reach Saudi Arabia. He can make life difficult for the U.S.
Mhm.
And this is what he had in mind. He's not here to see it, of course, because he died
Yeah.
in 2020.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about that and going back towards Soleimani, and you were talking about his interactions with Iraq and his plans and so on. Now, what was his full interaction with ISIS, let's say from 2014 to 2020?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is the Ghost and the Shadow Commander. They're fighting back and forth. So you think about ISIS taking control of the Anbar offensive in 2014. They take Mosul. They have a big chunk in western Iraq, largely desert. But
Hmm.
there's some significant cities: Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul. These are big cities. They almost take Kirkuk. The Kurds managed to push them back. In Syria, they've got the entire northeastern third of Syria, which if you look at where the oil is, that's where all the oil in Syria is. And remember, there was a lot of military equipment. ISIS was very good at scavenging U.S. military equipment left behind for the Iraqis. So you would see modern U.S. military artillery being driven by ISIS. They didn't know how to launch it sophisticatedly, but
Yeah.
they'd bring it over to Syria, point it at an enemy, and fire, and they were able to do quite a lot of damage. So what Soleimani did in reaction is there were two things. One, he really ramped up the PMCs in Iraq. These are local militias of Shia Iraqis, often with a background of that civil war against Al Qaeda. They're used to violence. They've had this. He's organizing these in militias. And these PMCs, I use the phrase, it's a constellation of different groups. There's hundreds of these PMCs. Some are very large and can deploy thousands of people. Some
Hmm.
are 20 guys guarding a neighborhood. But he's
Yeah.
getting them sophisticated equipment, training, and weaponry. And they're now fighting ISIS in Iraq. At the same time, Quds advisors are now in Syria. So think of these like U.S. Special Forces advisors, right? They're advising the Syrian military to fight. That's not proving effective. Soleimani brings over increasing numbers of military personnel, Iranian military personnel, and you heard me mention the Baji. The Baji, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but this is a paramilitary force that's not conventional infantry militaries. They're not full combat. They're designed to suppress rioters. They're usually rural individuals who have more of a conservative view. They're organized into groups so that when there's a protest or like the Green Revolution that happened in the first year of Obama's administration, he brings in the Baji. They suppress the protesters. They're very violent, but they're like batons and small arms. They're not like heavy weaponry. He's pulling this group into Syria, this paramilitary group. He's also going to Hezbollah and say, hey, Hezbollah, all that support we've given you, we're calling our chips in. So Hezbollah sends from Lebanon into Syria, and this becomes a meat grinder. This is not a U.S. type thing where it's a U.S. This is Shia forces organized by Soleimani fighting a lot of it's Syrian rebels. You know, there's a distinction here between the Syrian rebels and the ISIS, but they're also fighting ISIS. And this becomes a meat grinder where a lot of highly trained Quds commanders die. Soleimani himself has to go there a few times. So he's fighting back and forth. This is an active fight. Eventually, this massive coalition forms. You know, the U.S. coalition is all the NATO allies and the traditional allies you'd think. We go into Syria for an air campaign. Russia's intervened now and is helping Assad out because they want a Navy base. Iran's brought in their folks. Jordanian fighters are coming in. This sort of, and it wasn't that they were all coordinated. These were different coalitions all attacking ISIS at the same time. But the effect was they began driving ISIS back. And by 2018, you have sort of the last holdouts in eastern Syria, Raqqa. That was largely Kurdish. So in the east of Syria, the Kurds were doing a lot of the fighting at the end, backed by the U.S. military. In Iraq, though, the last big city is Mosul. And there, the Iranian PMCs had a huge influence as they moved north. They pushed ISIS back. And there's this weird sort of like detente between U.S.-backed forces attacking Mosul and Iranian-backed forces attacking Mosul. Kind of like, you go over there, we'll go over here. Let's not shoot each other, but we're all focused on Mosul. And it was just a brutal block by block. I mean, a lot what you're seeing today in Ukraine. I learned a lot about urban combat, not that I've been in it all as an analyst, obviously, but I learned a lot about what to expect of modern urban combat watching these and observing these different tactics playing out. And so by 2018, they take Mosul. Trump, you know, I'll give him credit later for but right now he does this very bizarre thing where he basically abandons the Kurds to the Turks and just pulls the U.S. out of Syria.
I remember discussion. That. Yeah.
But and basically abandons the field. And now Soleimani is left with a strong militia presence in Iraq that is effectively its own army. These PMCs, they don't report to the Iraqi government. They report to Soleimani. He's got Assad owes him his regime, and he's one of the three power players in the region: Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. These are the three big power players that have now divided up this whole region. They're looking really good 2018 heading into 2020.
Interesting. Well, you can definitely see why people would want to see Soleimani removed from the board, which brings me to the next question. You know, how did he actually die?
So this was, for those who remember, leading up to 2020, January and December, there were a series. I mean, the U.S. has always had bases in Iraq, so we did maintain. We withdrew. That was the tens of thousands of forces, but we still had 5,000-10,000 people in Iraq. We had Green Zone. We had bases. We're still doing operations. Obviously, we're coordinating with both the Iraqi government, the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north, for this counter-ISIS operation. So we had a lot of troops there doing counter-ISIS stuff, and they're still there. And Soleimani starts having these PMCs. They pushed ISIS out. I mean, that's a whole different discussion about how they can come back, and we may get to that, because you didn't eliminate them, but you pushed them into a clandestine terror role where they're in hiding, they're in running. Now the PMCs are like, so what happens next? Well, there's those American bases over there, and they look juicy. So the Iranian PMCs begin launching rockets at American bases. And this provokes a reaction that's not really surprising, right? You shoot us base, something bad's going to happen. And what happens is there's a series of attacks in December. Some contractors are killed. There are fatalities on the U.S. side. And remember, Soleimani has a history of attacking the U.S. This guy has a lot of power. It's not that he had no blood on his hands or anything like that. And I think, to his credit, Trump makes a very gutsy call that ends up resulting in a drone strike. Soleimani flies into Iraq. He lands in the Baghdad airport. He's just leaving the airport with a convoy, a couple vehicles. He's got with him senior leadership of the Quds. And the U.S. military does a drone strike, very controversial. They do a drone strike and they kill Soleimani and like several of the other major top commanders of the Quds and the significant commanders of the PMC. So in one strike, they not only take out Benjamin Franklin and George Washington for Iran,
Right.
they take out the liaison point between Iran and all this constellation of PMCs.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm a big critic of Trump on a lot of ways. But I
Mm-hmm.
got to say, this move he did, I give him a lot of credit for. Now, someone can say, well, Mattis was the Secretary of Defense and they planned it. That's fine. But the credit or the failure goes to the president in power at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think a lot of presidents would have made this call. It's very controversial. Some people think that
Mm-hmm.
it was an illegal assassination. My
Mm-hmm.
view is he was an active military commander entering a battlefield where combat had been done, and
Mm-hmm.
that made him a legitimate military target. Just like we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing, we see Ukraine. If a general pops up from Russia, Ukraine's
Mm-hmm.
not shy about dropping a missile on him. That's basically what we did with Soleimani. And there was very I'll put up another article. We tracked this as it happened. Like the day that it happened, I put a backgrounder out. It went viral. And I kind of predicted that people would overreact to this. And it certainly happened. There was, people were calling for World War III, that this was going to
Mm-hmm.
be the big thing. And there was a misreading, I think, culturally of what in Iran are these public rights of agitation that they've kind of got to show that this isn't going to stand, and they make bold declarations. They're going to launch an attacks, but really they don't want to get in a conventional conflict with the U.S. They don't even want to get
Mm-hmm.
in an asymmetric conflict with the U.S. So they're making all these signals. Trump's back here saying we're going to bomb the hell out of them. A lot of people are worried that this is going to escalate, and it's too far to go into. I'll post some of the links. There were
Mm-hmm.
two main articles we did, but it ends with a series of sort of token missile attacks from Iran back on U.S. bases, with
Yeah.
some signaling that occurs at the time that Iran says, this is it. You killed Soleimani. We're going to launch some missiles. This is it. We're done. There was clear signaling to me, at least, that this was going to be over. And then, unfortunately, in the very last hours that this crisis is happening and everyone's amped up, a
Mm-hmm.
flight leaves an Iranian airport. Iranian air defense mistakes it for an incoming rocket
Oh.
attack, shoots it down, and kills several hundred civilians. A lot of them were Canadian. This is one of
Oh.
the big tragedies of this back and forth, is that they
I
got
actually
caught
remember
up.
that incident. Yes.
Yeah, and again, I'll post some articles to this for people who want to go back on the InfoMullet and refresh it. But
Mm-hmm.
that puts a coda on it, and things kind
Yeah.
of cool down, and it goes back to the sort of the normal, not peaceful by any stretch of the imagination, but more like periodic attacks here. The Houthis are getting pounded by Saudi Arabia, and they're launching drone attacks. It goes back to the new normal, I think, until Hamas v. Israel kicks off.
Okay. So, what does this mean about the return of ISIS then?
So it was interesting. I did, in my master's, I was, getting a system dynamics up at WPI, and I was doing models. It started as a homework assignment. I'll be honest. It wasn't like any grand design, but as a homework assignment, I started modeling ISIS using system dynamics, and I ended up timing it right. I had my first model was 2014, right as they blew across the Anbar province, and I was beginning to do some serious system dynamics simulation where, we're looking at Syria and Iraq as a region. We're modeling these civilian segments of Arab Sunni and Arab Shia and Kurdish Sunni. That we're modeling those populations. We're modeling state actors and non-state actors and foreign actors supporting. We're simulating all this,
Mm-hmm.
and creating these forecasts of, at the time everyone's like, should we not pay ransom? Should we bomb the oil? They're doing these beheading videos.
Yeah.
And one of the benefits of these simulations is you can test policies in isolation. You can test them in combination. You can test them at different timing windows. You can also look at forecasts. And so by 2016, I had a pretty good simulation, and I went to a conference in Delft. This was right after there was a bombing. I think it was an ISIS actually bombing in the Netherlands. I remember it was a little bit tense because we're doing counter ISIS presentations 45 minutes from an active ISIS cell.
Mm.
And I was
Yeah.
never in any danger.
Yeah.
I don't want to be like, I wasn't running across the airport getting shot at. Sorry, Clinton.
Mm.
But these are academic presentations. It's a little
Yes.
intense, but you just
No.
flip PowerPoints. But what I said in that presentation is we can do a model that if you think about non-state actors in this violent state, they are operate as clandestine terrorists, which is they're hiding from everyone and they're
Mm-hmm.
committing terror attacks. If they have enough popular support, they're acting as an insurgency, where the only ones they're having to hide from are the state actors. That gives them a
Mm-hmm.
lot more freedom of movement. That gives them a lot more capability. They're not having to hide anything. And
Mm-hmm.
from there, they become a merging state actor. And these are continuums. They go left and right. So you think about ISIS, right? They were a clandestine terror that became an insurgency under
Yep.
AQI, got pushed back, stayed clandestine terror, became an insurgency in Syria, then became an emerging state actor 2013, 2014, 2015. I
Yes.
predicted that if they were defeated, there was so little support for them. They had caused so many problems that they wouldn't have the support of an insurgency. In Delft, I said, they're going to go back to be a clandestine terror. But the trick
Okay.
is they're not going to go away. The
No.
grievance that gave rise to them, the organizational structure, the legacy is there. And in
Hmm.
5 to 8 years, if we don't snuff them out, they're going to come back. And it's going to
Right.
come back as a clandestine terror. Then it's going to start to do an insurgency. Maybe we'll see them even emerge as an emerging state actor again. And
They
that was
could.
a
Interesting.
forecast in 2016. And sure enough, they attacked Baghdad in, I'll have to put the date up. I think it was like 2021. I'll put an article up where I talked about the return, the 7-year itch, return to Baghdad, where they launched a double suicide attack. It's very similar to one of their most infamous incidents during this main thing. And it was kind of like saying, hey, we're back. And
Yeah.
this really signaled ISIS's return. They now control the night in several areas in Iraq. And by that, that's an insurgent term where the insurgents have to hide during the day from the state
Right.
actor military. But at
Hmm.
night, people don't, that's a different question. And especially in these rural areas out in the deserts and stuff, they're an active presence in Iraq. And at the same time, you have obviously the withdrawal from Afghanistan that a lot, the Taliban was already retaking territory, and it just accelerated that complete collapse. Taliban's over. Now the pressure's off ISIS Khorasan. And so you have these returns of operational capabilities that they didn't have, coming back again. And I think what we're seeing in Iran is that, again, ISIS plays by its own book. Everyone would think, well, ISIS is going to attack the U.S. ISIS is going to attack the West. Their eyes. This is a grudge match for them. They
Sounds like.
took a lot of pain from Soleimani, and when they
Hmm.
targeted in 2018 the Baghdadi, he
Yep.
targeted the mausoleum of Ayatollah Khomeini. Now they're
Hmm.
targeting the mausoleum of Soleimani. It's like not just like punching you, but picking at that
Yeah.
spot and being like, "We're going to hit you again, right where you hurt."
Yeah. So there's a lot of personal reasons why they did what they did, regardless of what was going on in Gaza and so
Yeah.
on. Now, so what does all that mean to the larger context of regional security issues?
Well, regional security is a difficult question right now. So, obviously everyone's thinking of Hamas v. Israel, what's going on in Gaza, what happens. I've gone at length to talk about how I don't think Hamas can win the war they started. I think Israel can win the war, but who can win the peace? And I don't
Right.
think either Netanyahu's administration in Israel or Hamas, if they still exist going forward,
Hmm. Hmm.
and by the way, Hamas will also do that move. They'll go from
Right.
an
Yeah.
emerging state actor in Gaza, they'll go back to clandestine terror. They may get pushed out of Gaza, but they're still going to exist, and the same sort of cycle can repeat. So keep an eye on that.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
this whole thing now, you've got when I mentioned Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran were the regional power players, the death of Soleimani, I forecasted in those articles would have a major impact, and it knocked Iran completely off its game. They were
Yeah.
so overextended by his strategy of double envelopment. And then they
Yeah.
lost the one guy who had all the connections to keep
Yeah.
these things moving.
The guy that knew
They
how to
were in
everything
trouble. It's like
worked. Yeah.
America's Vietnam. They were
Yeah.
stuck in Syria. They're stuck in Iraq. They're stuck with the Houthis. Now they're having to defend Hamas. They may not really want this. They're kind of struggling a little bit
Yeah.
to exert their influence. They're obviously still a player, but not
Yeah.
nearly as strong as they were. The big winners in the region are Saudi Arabia, which is consolidated under Mohammed bin Salman. He's the crown
Hmm.
prince, but he's effectively the running Saudi Arabia. He's consolidated his power. He's
Hmm.
checked Iran. Removing Soleimani helped him out immensely.
Hmm.
He's a major power. And then Erdogan in Turkey is the other big. Turkey's really gained the most power out of all these dynamics over the last 10 years. That's a whole different
Hmm.
conversation. But really, and so you've got three players in here, and two of them may be working. Saudi Arabia was working with Israel to normalize relations. That's one of the reasons people think Hamas struck at Israel, the
Yeah.
normalization process, the Abraham Accords. People thought Saudi Arabia was getting ready to declare normal relations that would have undercut the Palestinian cause. I think that
Hmm.
definitely contributed, probably not the only thing, but definitely a big one. And it certainly had that effect. Saudi Arabia is now pulled back a little. I think they're going to return to the table because the pragmatic interest of Saudi Arabia align more with Israel than they do with Iran. And this is, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I think
Hmm.
you're going to have the resolution of the Gaza situation, unfortunately, is going to be very, very ugly and create a lot of grievance for a long time. But eventually, that sort of conventional conflict is going to end. I have no idea what's going to happen the day after, two-state solution, one-state solution, UN coalition, whatever. But you're going to have this ordering between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then Iran trying to have some influence.
Mm. Now, that's all very interesting, and I had a couple more questions that came off of that. But and it's you described how you created simulations in the past for ISIS. Now, can you tell us how those simulations that over time can account for the seemingly one-off events like terrorism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, the system dynamics simulations, we're not doing pinpoint predictions that says ISIS is going to be at this location at this strength on this day. We're doing behavior over time. So it's a 10-year simulation. You ask yourself, well, over 10 years, can you predict they're going to attack Soleimani's mausoleum? No.
Yeah.
System dynamics simulations, they build a causal structure on the systems. They're really, what is the structure that drives this complex adaptive system? That's what you're simulating. And you're really looking at how things move between those. So within that context, our simulation does account for terrorism. There is something in there that looks at, how effective are your intelligence forces? How effective is the non-state actor conducting terrorism? There's things that determine how many casualties you have. And you may have periodic large-scale casualties arising from that, but that's a byproduct of the system forces. It's not saying that we know for sure this particular this model that we built, and if you're doing any sort of policy modeling, you actually want to be very careful not to build a model that tries to do too many things. You might have a model that says we want to see the risk of a one-off catastrophic attack. That would be one kind of model. But the kind of model we built for policy analysis, or that a lot of businesses use and things like that, is how do you look at behavior over time and policies, not whether they're going to stop this one attack, but do they reduce the influence of ISIS such that they can't launch an attack? Or do they protect Iran such that they're more resilient against that kind of attack? And so, no, our models do not say there will be a mausoleum attack in January in 20, but they do, and of course, this is outside the horizon of our original forecast, but they do look at what are the conditions that give rising cause to violence, which could include an endogenous uprising of terrorists. So our models can say, where there was no terrorist group in the past, here's one that spontaneously emerges. But
And
it's all
that
based
is,
on system structure of the complex adaptive system.
and that's the question that I was actually looking for. If they can map the behavior, the models can map the behavior going from, from the point where they're hiding, I can't think of the word, going to the
Clandestine
insurgency,
terrorism.
clandestine terrorism, to going to insurgents, then going to, a non-state actor. And so you can see the behavior, whether it's rising or
And
falling
that's
through the
so that
models.
model, which started for ISIS, that's really where it's now specialized. Is we've done work. We did the work with Marine Corps, where we're looking at civilian militaries. We've expanded it so it's not just modeling Syria and Iraq. We can instantiate it in 160 countries. We can
Yeah,
model everything less than conventional. So we can model mass resistance, popular uprisings. They may not even be
exactly.
violent. We can model when violence occurs, like how does you go from nonviolent to periodic terrorism to large networks of terrorism to the emergence of an insurgency, and it can model all of that back and forth. Again, you don't want ever want one simulation to model everything.
You
We
can't. Yeah.
stop our models at conventional conflicts. It cannot model, for
Yeah.
example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in that conflict. There's
Right.
too many things we didn't do. But when we were working with the Marine Corps, we built a simulation of what would happen under a hypothetical ceasefire. And we just
Okay.
arbitrarily picked. We're not saying this is realistic, but we say, what if there was a ceasefire in December 2022? What would happen over the next 10 years under a couple different permutations? And that we
Okay.
can model, because that's now a less than conventional. It can be a frozen conflict. It can be a demilitarized zone. We also modeled Myanmar in the Civil War. We can now instantiate that same simulation and look at different countries and model these kind of, and we're not making predictions. We're
Right.
making forecasts of scenarios and say, here's 10 scenarios that may occur. Here's what you need to look for to know that this one is occurring over the other. We do
Yes.
not do predictions in system dynamics, but we do
No.
forecasts.
Likely outcomes of behaviors that we're seeing that we
Exactly.
model that are likely to come. Yeah, which is great. Okay, so all that is very fascinating. Now, if someone wanted to learn more about that in systems thinking, how would they do that?
Well, this is why I don't advertise VPNs or mobile phones. We advertise the subtly slide into the funded sponsorship. No, so Dialectic does have, we do simulations, but if you take a step back, you don't need to have a math degree or an engineering background to sort of understand systems thinking as what are these structures that underlie the complex systems? And it doesn't have to be violence, right? It can be,
Yeah.
what are the relationships I'm seeing at work? Why does a strategy work or not work? Why is the culture the way it is as an organization? What do I need to do to change this? All of these are complex adaptive systems, and systems thinking gives you kind of a language. It's a
Hmm.
grammar, a vocabulary, and a syntax of understanding these systems and saying, hey, what kind of system am I in right now? And what do I need to do? It's based off a lot of existing research. This has been going on for decades. We have a training now that we have an awareness training. It's designed for anyone. You don't have to come in with any background. It's very simple and easy to learn. We're going to put the training up at our dialectic.sims or dialecticsims.com/our services /training. That's where all our training is located. The awareness is hosted online. I think it's like 170, 179 bucks.
Okay.
It's a really simple course. It's designed
Hmm.
for anyone to understand these concepts of systems thinking and these concepts of system structure in a way they can apply to their everyday life, their business, their organization. We are getting further development, introduction,
Yeah.
intermediate, advanced courses,
Good.
but this is just a real basic awareness. And that will be up on the website there. Go check it out if you're interested. And
Hmm.
occasionally, if you're a Patreon, again, patreon.com/InfoMullet, we do free trainings every once in a while. We did 2 trainings here recently before the start of the new year where we did this awareness training for the Patreon,
Yep.
a certain tier Patreon. So go check
Hmm.
it out. And if you don't, again, everything on the InfoMullet is put out there for free. So
Hmm.
anything we do is going to be there. If you don't have and don't want to do the training and all that, just like, click, follow, subscribe. We really appreciate the support.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I have a few more questions about ISIS, and then I have one final big question about ISIS. And it's kind of, as you've explained it, I think I know the answer to it, but I'm gonna put it out there anyway. But back to ISIS. Some people call ISIS IS, ICE or ISIL or Daesh, and what's that all about?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of the funny things that Americans tend to do is we sort of fixate on names and don't understand why they are. So let's go back. Um, ISIS and I use ISIS just for
Okay.
things. All of those, by the way, they mean effectively the same thing. That's
Okay.
the short answer. All those different words mean the same thing. But the reason why they differ is ISIS is making a claim. They claim that they're going to restore the Islamic Caliphate, and they're using it based off the wilayats. Wilayats is the Arabic term for province, and I'm probably
Hmm.
butchering the name, but wilayat, Wilayt. So ISIS in Khorasan province, that's a wilayat. ISIS
Yep.
in Iraq and Syria, that's a wilayat. And they were describing themselves earlier. Remember, one of the early names they took was ISI, the
Okay.
Islamic State of Syria, right?
Okay.
So, but it's not Syria and Iraq as we know it now. It's what it was back in the Ottoman Empire at a certain time. And this
Oh, okay.
includes Israel, Jordan. Like when they said, so what these are, ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, right?
Okay.
Levant L.
Okay.
ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
Okay.
All of these mean the same. It's a geographic claim of territory that covers much of the Middle East today, not just
Okay.
where Iraq and Syria are now, but all these other Lebanon, Jordan, large parts of Saudi Arabia, right? And this is where you can look at this territorial claim. And
Hmm.
before they went global, this is where they were focusing on. So the
Hmm.
difference between ISIL and ISIS is just whether you refer to that area as the Levant, which is a
Okay.
historical name with historical meaning, or Syria, and they mean Greater Syria in the Ottoman terms. Now, IS, they declared al-Baghdadi declared the global caliphate, and a lot of people use the so-called Islamic State because they don't want to give credibility. So you'll see them say the so-called.
Yep.
Again, means the same thing. Daesh, Daesh. This is kind of a funny one
Daesh.
because
Okay.
Americans kind of got suckered in by some internet memes that this was something that sounded like shoe in Arabic, and it was this insulting
Oh,
name.
okay.
And if you
Yeah.
called ISIS Daesh, they would get really offended and be
Yes.
upset at you and hurt you. I hate to break it to you, they would have hurt you anyway. These guys are like not going to get upset that you call them names and say bad things about them.
Okay.
What Daesh is the acronym in Arabic of ISIS or ISIL. That's all it is, right? It's just
Okay.
the Arabic version of the same acronym. Now, the reason you see all these different names is different organizations have different protocols. I think
Yeah.
the U.S. State Department and Obama called it ISIL. I
Okay.
think the U.S. military and Trump called it ISIS. Like the
Yeah.
BBC always refers to it as the so-called Islamic State. They spell it out. They don't use the acronym. In Al Jazeera or more Arabic, you may see references to Daesh or things like that. So
Yeah.
all of these things, all of the names mean the same thing. It's a geographic area that they're claiming to that's what they want to take. That's where they're going
Okay.
to base their global caliphate off of.
Okay. So it's not an insult. They don't take it as
No,
an insult.
it's not. Or let's put it this way: it's not going to make them any more
Yeah.
upset at you than they probably already are. These are
They're
not
not
guys
gonna.
who
They're not
wake
gonna
up
take
on
their
good side of
shoes
the bed.
off and throw them at you as they did with
Yeah.
Bush Jr.
Now, shoes are a
Okay.
historical inset. That's why Bush was
Yes.
dodging shoes from Iraq when that protest.
Well, they're also being thrown at them, so good reason to
Yeah.
dodge. But okay, so those answer my like final questions that I just had on the ISIS front. Now, here's my. You've done an excellent job at describing this and the whole situation and what it means and the players and their interests. So this last question is because we get a lot of reports from everybody taking credit for this in the media. So, and ISIS is claiming responsibility. From what you told me here today, I can easily see that, yeah, this should be them. This is what they would want to do. They would want to take advantage of this. They got plenty of reason to do that. But so the answer is really now, should we actually believe it was them? Or are they
Yeah.
claiming somebody else's
So
work?
when it comes to non-state actors, and I'm talking about the organized ones, the Irish Republican Army or the New Irish Republican Army or ISIS or folks like that, they don't mess around with claiming credit. It's generally, it's counterintuitive. In the US, we're gamers. We think, oh, I'd claim credit for stuff that's not me. The problem is these attacks are provocative attacks that you want a certain reaction from the enemy. Like they may be trying to provoke Iran into invading Afghanistan to topple the Taliban.
Exactly.
So ISIS and Khorasan can get ahead by division. That's a very common strategy. It's called, it's Kukulin describes it, and I've talked about it before, where somebody does a provocative 9/11 provocative attack in the internal space to provoke a reaction in your space, hoping to draw in all the local combatants against whoever came in and gain power by having a foreign advisory come in. And I don't know if that's ISIS case strategy. We'll see what Iran does in the thing. There's some real tensions between the Taliban and Iran. They've worked together. They've fought together. They've killed each other. That's a big murky question. But ISIS as far as I've seen, there's always a question mark. But I've always seen when they make a claim, they have a basis for the claim. It doesn't. So you think about here. There's directed. Led, directed, and inspired. And what that means is led is an ISIS team going to conduct an ISIS attack. Those are ISIS soldiers. They're moving out of the region into an area that's doing it. Directed is they have an existing non-state actor that they say, go, you do this, right? Or they're communicating with someone directly. Inspired, they have a lot of propaganda where they release magazines. They have a flashy magazine called Inspire. It literally looks like Better Home and Garden. Some of these things are like better instructions for making a bomb out of a kettle, for soup, a crock pot, right? But it's like Better Home and Gardens for terrorists. And these magazines, ISIS has always had very slick propaganda. They're very slickly produced, and they're provoking people to inspire them. So like the Pulse Club shooting, there's no indication that he had direct contact, that he had received an email or gotten a dead drop, but he was inspired in part by ISIS. And as he conducted the shooting, he swore the bayat, the allegiance. So ISIS claimed credit for it. They had a basis to do so. I've never seen ISIS claim, or very rarely seen them claim credit where they don't have a good basis for which they can make that claim. Because if you think about it, you only have to be caught with your pants down once to claim something that wasn't you, and now your credibility is lost. So the non-state actors that are organized and serious, they generally don't claim credit for stuff they don't do. And you can kind of, so I think ISIS certainly has, they have if they didn't have a team themselves do it, which is very possible given the location, they probably directed someone to do this.
Okay. But ultimately they're responsible for it. Well, that was excellent, Tim. And those are all the questions I needed to ask you or wanted to ask you. I think you did an excellent job at answering them.
Yeah, I don't know if we should call these MicroMullets. We're like an hour into this, but hopefully it was.
Yeah.
It's not heavily resourced. This is just me riffing off what I know. We'll put the InfoMullet links in the bottom. If you got to this far and you like this format, ask them some questions. What do you want us to cover that's topical in the news? The whole point of this is Bruce and I get together, we pick a topic, and he just asks questions like, hey, I'm interested in this stuff, and we can kind of go forward from there. If you haven't yet, like, follow, subscribe, do the thing, hit the bell, do all that stuff. There'll be some videos coming up somewhere that you can click on and check her out. We got a lot of content on the channel. We're looking forward to covering the 2024 presidential election, but we're not limited to that. Like, obviously, we're dealing with foreign affairs today. So if there's something you want to see covered, throw us a comment, or if you just like the new format or want to say hi to Bonky after a thing, drop us a comment in the chat. Really appreciate today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.